All right, we are going to go ahead and get started today. Again, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Ensure Working Capital Results Last. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to today's moderator, Jennifer Ulrich.
Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think it's going to be a really good panel today. We wanted to make this a bit more casual and more of an organic conversation. We've brought together some of our subject matter experts across the organization, and I'll give them the opportunity in just a moment to introduce themselves. But just to kind of start with a little bit of background into why we selected this topic, we found over the years that organizations garner quite a bit of value from working capital strategies and implementing them and going through all of the efforts across the organization and bringing together different business units and making sure that they're going to have the success that they intend to. But what we often found too is that organizations don't always think about the long-term compliance side of things, making sure they're putting in place the right strategies to ensure those results last. We tend to see things in a short-sighted sort of 12 to 18-month time frame and get really excited about the results, but we want to make sure that what we're doing is going to have a long-term impact. So that's really where we're focused today, and where organizations have maybe gone through the initial exercise of a working capital strategy, but want to make sure that they're thinking about that long-term side of things. So as I mentioned, we have some great panelists with us here today, and we're going to go ahead and jump right in. We have three individuals joining us today, so I'd like to kind of go to each of you to introduce yourselves and then set the stage for the topic today. Describe the value of a strong working capital strategy from your own perspective, and we can start with Brent.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Hi, everybody. My name is Brent Kinman, and I run North American sales here at Corcentric, and have largely, from a career perspective, spent most of my time in the payables and receivables end of working capital. By way of introduction, previous to Corcentric, I spent 18 years at SAP, first on the buy side, the payable side of the business. And then about halfway through, got into the payments and receivables end of the business. And this is a topic that I'll say I'm passionate about. And the only reason I am is I've seen the extraordinary results, the transformational results that a solid working capital strategy can deliver. I'll just share with you a couple of business outcomes that I've seen along the way, one of which was with a major telecom here in the United States, who was able to unlock working capital in their payables to the degree that they were able to pay down debt and save themselves millions and millions of dollars by preserving their investment grade credit rating. Worked with a food and beverage company that was able to make a major acquisition, largely funded from, again, the cash that was seized up in their payables and receivables. Another food and beverage company who launched a strategic initiative, a rebranding effort, to the tune of $1 billion in costs that they unlocked from their working capital. A major home improvement retailer who was able to open up 3 stores with just a single day improvement in the cash conversion cycle. And so I've spent a career paying attention to 2 very important questions. When, as a corporate, shall we pay our suppliers? And the second is, when shall we be paid by our customers? And so the answer to those 2 questions can have a major impact into not only the health of a corporate, but also has enduring effects and supply chain health effects down the line to primary, secondary, and even tertiary suppliers who service major corporates. So glad to be here today and looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Brent. And now we'll go to Robert.
Thanks, Brent. I'm Robert Johnson. I've been with Corcentric since February. Been with Vendor N, which is a company they acquired in February, for 8 years. At Vendor N, we helped companies move to electronic payment modalities. And with that messaging, when we reached out to suppliers to find out what their preferred payment method, we often incorporated working capital strategies in that messaging, where we would often provide buyers and suppliers a way to connect and provide benefits to suppliers to be able to get paid earlier, whereas helping the buyers be able to pay more efficiently and electronically. So lots of experience with messaging the working capital strategies and implementing working capital strategies between buyers and suppliers, and also using that opportunity when you're reaching out to buyers and suppliers to have them help send invoices electronically, get paid electronically, and with that comes with a term acceleration too, to really streamline the AP and AR process. So very excited to be with you guys today. And Lee, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi all, my name is Lee Allen. I'm Senior Vice President for EMEA North. I'm joining you today from London, which is where I was both born and raised, hence the accent, for which I apologise. Hopefully you can understand me on the way through. I've spent nearly 2 decades working in order to cash, which is pretty scary when I say it out loud. And in that capacity, I've spent a lot of time with accounts receivable teams throughout Europe, and doing a lot of listening to credit and collections staff. So I'm predominantly here to sort of represent the accounts receivable side of the equation. I think working capital is well established as the prevalent metric for measuring a business's health, and the accounts receivable side of that is really, I think we all know cash is king. As someone that's been involved in the sales process for a long time, people tell me it's not sold until it's paid for. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion and bringing some of that experience to bear to the conversation.
Thank you, gentlemen. So I think from sort of what I've heard through all of those introductions, it sounds like strained cash flow could be sort of a big problem that drives a working capital strategy, whether it's in place or you're just getting started. So Robert, if you wouldn't mind just giving us some other pain points that you've seen over the years that bring organizations to implement a working capital strategy.
Yeah, great question. One of the biggest challenges that buyers face is the speed to be able to approve an invoice. So having an electronic invoicing, AP workflow solution is pretty critical. We've seen clients that don't have solutions like that in place, and they're not able to benefit from discounts because they're not able to approve invoices fast enough. They have a decentralized invoice approval process, and the invoice may go out to somebody on the field that's busy working on a project, and they don't get to the approval quick enough for clients to be able to for buyers to be able to approve the invoices fast enough to be able to take advantage of the discount. So having a really streamlined AP workflow solution with automated business rules and straight through processing to be able to capture discounts is an investment that most buyers should make to be able to capitalize on their working capital strategy. You may have procurement or somebody else that's able to negotiate a really good trade discount, but if you can't approve the invoice fast enough, it's all for nothing, right? So having the ability to approve invoices fast, I think, is an investment that we see buyers making.
Thanks, Robert. And I think that's really important as we think about sort of the end-to-end process of things. We spend a lot of time on the procurement side, coming from the advisory team and Legacy Source One, and now this gives us that opportunity to see the full spectrum of how it's impacted on the payment, the AP, the AR side. So, Brent, I know you covered just a little bit some of the components of sort of a standard approach to a working capital strategy. Would you mind just for a moment kind of stepping back and telling us what, based on what you said before, what makes for a durable strategy? What's, just high level, what are components that you would think about to make sure that you're extending into that long-term sustainability side?
Yeah, you bet. It always should start. By the way, before I kick off here, there are 4 major elements. The first of which is the most important. We're going to touch on it probably a little bit later. But the first element of a durable working capital strategy is organizational alignment. Let us just say that the major stakeholders within any given corporate, especially on the payables and receivable side, we'll get to inventory here in a second, but on the payables and receivable side, you have procurement, AP, and finance/treasury. And what we often find is those motivations and scorecards, if you will, are not aligned. So element number one, before you really engage a provider, or if you can't sort it out yourself, make sure your provider can help facilitate that organizational alignment, because it is absolutely, at the end of the day, the most important element, which is why I mentioned it first. The second element is going to be technology. There are a lot of different providers, both on the payables and receivable side. And again, I'll handle inventory last. But if you can't pay any given supplier on a day of your choosing, your working capital strategy on the payables side is probably going to be suboptimal. Let's just get that right, because you're going to have your suppliers' trust. You're going to have your own organization's trust. And these days and times, if you don't have a technology platform to facilitate these kinds of things, you're not going to get very far. The third element is the actual functions themselves, mainly the AP organization and the AR function. You really have two options there. Once you have your technology in place, are you going to use your people, those that report into the corporate, or are you going to outsource? That's really your two major options there. Both have pros and cons, but ultimately you want to, from a process perspective, have best practices in place. So you need a trusted advisor to make sure that you're doing, what is best practice and what is essential. I can't state this enough, that we tend to overcomplicate the processes in payables and receivables and the people doing them. So there's some benchmarks out there about how many invoices, let's say, for instance, a single FTE should be able to workflow and approve in a year. Same thing on the receivable side. So pay particular interest to the people themselves. Do you want to outsource it or not is the biggest question. If you do or don't, then you have some secondary and tertiary decisions to make. And then the fourth element is the capital that you're going to use. Oftentimes, let's just go back to the two fundamental questions. When shall we pay our suppliers? And when shall we get paid by our customers? What you will find oftentimes is that a third-party capital provider can often allocate capital in paying early or letting you get paid early with a more efficient source of capital than your business can produce. So looking at your cost of capital and understanding how much the money you have costs you can allow a provider to step in and if you will, provide and inject liquidity into your company cheaper, better, faster than perhaps you can do yourself. So in kind of review here, 4 major elements: organizational alignment first, let's get that knocked out. Then you're going to have technology. Then you're going to have to decide who will perform the processes, both are just inside your 4 walls or out. And then do you want to add a capital provider to help accentuate, let's say, the results that you get? So Lee, you have anything to add to that?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you've just said. And as much as I would love to add something on top of that, I think you've done such a thorough and eloquent job of it, I would actually struggle to. So I'll quote Shakespeare and say there ain't no point in gilding the lily.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yes, and I appreciate your thoroughness, Brent. I would have to agree that the organizational change component is so critical, and I think it's so undervalued when organizations start these sort of initiatives. They don't take into account the stakeholder impact to all the different elements that are going to actually have an end user effect. So, and I certainly open this up to anybody, any of the panelists here, in terms of what we see, like what actually breaks down working capital strategy over time. But, if we think outside of that organizational component, are there any key aspects that we could point to that, after the initial excitement dies down, if you will, what actually breaks down the strategy?
Yeah, the 2 sources of breakdown, and hopefully no one will be offended about this, but the breakdown occurs in procurement and your sales organization. So one side on the payables end, one side on the receivables end. So back to that organizational alignment real quick, right? You got to get people's scorecards, right? Their compensation plans, how they're motivated to create value for the firm and for themselves. On the payables end of the business, what you'll oftentimes find is the erosion of your days payable outstanding will largely be driven by procurement. And how can that be? Well, it depends on their scorecard, but oftentimes what you find is they'll trade shorter terms for maybe price compression. So if you've got necessarily the scorecard and the compensation plan for procurement correct, then actually the place to start to prevent erosion is with contract lifecycle management. The ability for the organization to see the terms and conditions and contracts real time, as well as a way to workflow certain non-standard terms and conditions, makes all the difference here. You know, you want people to be very deliberate before they break a policy. And if they know that that workflow will ultimately land on the desk of someone of prominence, they're much more reluctant, let's say, to go out of policy. I found that day one. While we were working with a major food and beverage company, not even the ones I mentioned before, excuse me. And they're like, okay, where are we going to start? And really where we like to start is with contract lifecycle management. Let's stop the bleeding. Let's get the policies in place and be very deliberate when we deviate from them. And this is on the payable side of the business. The other side is sales and receivables. And this is where your CRM can do basically the exact same thing that your contract lifecycle tool does on the payable side. Your CRM tool can go a long way in the receivables game to, again, enforce policies on what terms your sales organization is ultimately going to give your customers. So technology and policy, especially systematic enforcement, makes all the difference in the world. And then finally, I'm going to go right back to the payables end of the business. Setting policies with your suppliers as to when an invoice term starts ticking makes a big difference. We have seen gains in days payable outstanding by setting policies with suppliers that I think are fair, which is, hey, supplier, right, we've digitized this process. Let's say you've got a P2P system in and you've spent blood, treasure, toil, and tears getting in there to drive this compliance. Well, the supplier really owes you a correct invoice. So one policy you could make is, hey, look, the term on an invoice doesn't start until you submit a valid and authentic invoice instead of just sending us quote unquote junk. So it's little things like this that can make the program durable, enduring, let's say, for the long haul. And then the final element, and I'll yield the floor back, is you're going to have to constantly benchmark the market. We espouse here at Corcentric that we want to pay suppliers on a fair market term. And what that means is we want to pay them when everybody else does. And so let me tell you, different categories of spend are constantly turning over what the customary term is. You will notice if you look that global terms expand during times of economic expansion, and they contract during times of recession. And then different industries will move. For example, food and beverage from 2016 to 2020, the average DPO of the suppliers in that category moved out by about 30 days. So keeping your finger on the pulse, because you don't want to be predatory to your suppliers. You want to pay them when everybody else does. So watching the market will go a long way in making your program as good or better than any others.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate that. So I want to kind of switch the spotlight over to Robert for a little bit, just because I noticed you're talking a lot about suppliers, and oftentimes what we've seen with some of the work that you do, Robert, I think I've actually seen supplier is king, right? And I know that Lee talks about cash is king, so we'll go there next. But when we think about the supplier side of things, oftentimes we see extending payment terms as one particular element of creating some short-term impact, but also long-term impact. Could you speak to a couple different components here? And apologize for the rapid fire of questions, but what are some other ways that we see a long-term impact from an AP perspective? And then if you could focus specifically on, I know you've been talking about the buyer and supplier side of the payment terms. What are some concerns that you see coming from suppliers besides that concern that extending payment terms is great for the buyers, but what about the suppliers? So both of those components, if you don't mind covering for us.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, what's often good for the buyer is not always good for the supplier, right? The buyers are looking to extend terms. The suppliers are looking to get paid faster, right? So how do you find the right balance? And what we found is the best is just to provide the suppliers options, right? Because every supplier has different kind of needs for cash, and they may be willing to offer discounts in exchange to get paid early. So some of the best strategies we've seen when a buyer is looking to push out terms and extend terms is to provide suppliers different choices to keep their terms the same, or even additional incentives to offer even a bigger discount for earlier payment. So, buyers that have, supply chain financing, dynamic discounting, and flexibility to be able to provide suppliers different options is key, right? Because then it's not a message that, hey, we're pushing your terms out 30 days. It's, hey, we're pushing your terms out 30 days, but we also have other options if you want to keep your terms the same. And giving them kind of a menu of choices to choose from is important, right? Because then it shows that you're valuing the supplier and what the impact to them is of your working capital strategy. Being able to provide value to the suppliers is important, right? If they want remittance details in a certain format, whether it's EDI or CTX, often providing those additional value components allows suppliers to, accept a term increase, or they may be willing to offer a discount because they're getting that added value. Regarding your other question about long-term impact of AP with working capital strategies, what we found is AP is just much happier when they have a working capital strategy in place, right? We've seen clients and buyers that have 50 different unique terms within their supplier base, right? It's so hard to manage for them. Suppliers are calling, where's my payment? Because they don't have the technology in place to approve invoices fast enough. They don't know when they're going to get paid. So having a working capital strategy in place long term really helps AP because it's more consistent. They have less terms to manage, less suppliers calling with questions about where's my payment. Suppliers see the consistency, they know when they're going to get paid, and it just makes for a better buyer supplier experience overall.
Thanks, Robert. So now I want to kind of flip to the other side on the AR side, and Lee, give you the floor for a few minutes. Tell us a little bit about how we can see the DSO side have a longer term impact, and any other side, from an accounts receivable perspective that you see impacting working capital.
Yeah, so the DSO is really just the measure of working capital from the AR side of things. So working capital strategy is really about what's that working capital going to be used for? How's it going to be deployed? So the key ones always are going to be around providing flexibility to expand or enhance the business. Obviously, it improves liquidity. You can drive profitability off the back of working capital. But I think the big one that's sort of come to the top of the list in the last 18 months is providing a response when economic conditions become challenging. So globally, we've been dealing with COVID, and that's had a little bit of an impact. Here in the UK, we've Brexited. We exited the European Union, which has created some unusual and unforeseen economic impacts. So the focus on working capital really comes to the fore in those situations. And one of the big bottlenecks, one of the places where the money can build up is in the balance sheet on the accounts receivable side. So when you're looking at DSO, what you're really talking about is how quickly we're accessing this cash, this king that everyone's after. How do we go about doing that? And that's where the sustainable working capital solution comes into play, because it's not something that sits in isolation. So Brent spoke about it earlier. I think in accounts receivable worlds, sales is sometimes a dirty term, right? Because under the pressure to hit quota, to perform, it's the sales organization that is likely to break the conditions and the rules of your credit policy, right? And when they do that, it impacts on your DSO, which is impacting on your working capital. So I think we're going to talk a bit more about the DSO side of things, but the recognition really is that nothing exists in a vacuum. They're all interconnected and support each other. So that key message of alignment across the organization to make sure you're pursuing the same outcomes, albeit from different perspectives, that I think is the sort of key component that underwrites all of the successes in however you achieve this, what technology you onboard, what partners you use, how you develop your own process. It's all got to be joined up thinking.
Thanks, Lee. And I just wanted to kind of go off a couple of your comments. One piece being around the impact of the pandemic. So I know people can, if you don't have a really solid thought out strategy in place, you can tend to be a bit reactive, right? So we've seen over the years that people might start with DPO because that seems like the easiest thing to do, but then they don't think about the after effect of DSO. Relating back to the pandemic, I think we saw a lot of organizations having to rethink DIO, their inventory. So a lot of companies got stuck with a ton of inventory and a lot of excess there, where if they didn't have a strategy in place to manage all of that as part of the cash conversion cycle, it was a lot that they had to reprocess and really consider to the balance sheet, as you were saying. And then another point around your technology comment around AR, just talking to a customer yesterday that was quite nicely complimenting some of our technology solutions, but also stating that on that side, having to deal with so many different technologies, that's something that we have to think about too, is when they're having to process invoices and dealing with so many different customer solutions, and it can create a lot of extra work. So wherever we can streamline things from a process perspective where the organization has control, it's really important to think about that, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people kind of behind the computers running these things and that are impacted by the additional weight of all this. I want to move on to, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the things we saw outside of the clients where we managed the invoice distribution was a sort of knock-on problem from working from home. So their invoice distribution relied on access to print rooms and equipment held in offices. They couldn't access those offices, so they couldn't produce their invoice. When they could, they were posting that invoice to an address which was no longer being manned. So there's a kind of a double whammy effect there, that if you can't raise and send an invoice and your customer can't receive it, they're surely not going to pay it. So again, it sort of impacts on DSO. So the clients we have where we're managing that distribution for them, they obviously didn't suffer that problem because there's not that reliance on equipment they can't access.
Right. No, that's a really good point. So I want to kind of shift over to the metrics and reporting side of all of this. We've had some really great discussions so far around strategies, but as we all know, you really need to be able to track some of this with hard metrics and reporting. So Brent, if you wouldn't mind just taking us through a couple of ways that you can measure this and to really show how you're hitting your key performance indicators from a working capital strategy.
Yeah, and I'm going to go with something a little bit unorthodox here, at least in my viewpoint. When looking at metrics and KPIs, I would suggest looking outward first and then looking inward. The outward piece would be, let's go to the payables end of the business, is looking at your supply chain health. So many companies have a supplier relationship, supplier performance management program, and paying particular interest to the health of your critical suppliers. not perhaps the ones, that, have, your supplier that has thousands of customers and they're well capitalized. It's not those ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about your suppliers that are less well capitalized, but yet perform some critical service or provide some critical component to your business. Watching them, their solvency and their performance is often the canary in the coal mine that something's wrong with your working capital strategy on the payable side. Generally speaking, it is either compared to the market, you're paying them later than you otherwise would, or they have no early payment program to take advantage of. And oftentimes suppliers are reluctant to raise their hand and say, hey, I need early payment, because they're either embarrassed or ashamed that they're having a working capital program. So those KPIs of your suppliers' bankruptcies or insolvencies or problems is where you need to look first. And then the same really holds true on the receivables end of the business and measuring the solvency of your customers. If you're noticing chronic problems with getting paid, it is oftentimes instructive to find out why. And I'd say the majority of them they're having a cash crunch that can then lead to secondary and tertiary effects on you. So look outward when trying to measure the efficacy of your own program. And then internally, it is, I would say, at least twice a year, benchmark yourself against the market. Don't necessarily pay attention to days payable outstanding or days sales outstanding. Yes, you want to compare yourself against others, especially your competitors. It is oftentimes better to look a little bit more granularly as you group your suppliers into different categories. How are you doing compared to others? How are you doing to that supplier's day sales outstanding, if you can figure it out? It is oftentimes the best way to make progress and to steer policies on when you pay your suppliers or when you indeed get paid by your customers, is to compare yourselves to others, because this is a marketplace. I oftentimes look with somewhat of dismay that if a particular customer of ours finds out that one of their competitors is getting a better price, they immediately go and try and rectify that and get that same price. Remember, terms have real economic value. And when you find yourself behind the market in any one given category on terms, you got to address it. And then, finally, at kind of the top end, the things I like to measure are, the number of early payment contracts that you have in place, the amount of money that you are accelerating to your supply base, and keeping that in tune with with Treasury on how much capital they want to allocate to the program. And then certainly just the cash conversion cycle itself, right? Where's your days payable outstanding compared to others? Where's your days sales and payables compared to others? And then we'll kind of hit on inventory. And I will freely admit that inventory is a whole universe in and of itself. But let us say this: generally speaking, small improvements in inventory make massive changes on the balance sheet. So working with companies to help you keep enough inventory on hand so that you won't be caught short, but also making sure that you're not holding on to inventory that is, colloquially, burning a hole in your pocket.
Okay. Robert, would you be able to add anything around, besides what Brett mentioned, and possibly thinking about from a visibility perspective, we think about metrics and reporting, what are some other ways that you might manage your working capital strategy long term?
Yeah, one thing that I would add to what Brent said is, oftentimes a buyer or a client's ERP system is designed to, take discounts if the payment's being made within the term, but then not take discounts if it's paid after the term. So having, dashboards that show, what discounts are available, within the invoice approval workflow is critical, right? And then what discounts were actually captured, right? That will show kind of the health of how fast a buyer is able to approve an invoice and pay an invoice to make sure they're benefiting and capturing as much discount as possible. You don't want to go through the exercise of putting together a working capital strategy and getting your suppliers to agree to certain terms and then not pay them fast enough to benefit from it. So being able to measure that and dashboards is pretty critical. The other thing that Brent hit on earlier on was just make sure there's organizational alignment, right? You have multiple departments involved in a working capital strategy. You got sales, you got procurement, you got treasury, you got AP, and they all have different goals. And so what we found worked the best is organizations that put in incentive programs that aligned the organization, right? So that they're not working against each other, they're working with each other. So everybody benefits from working capital strategies. So procurement wants to negotiate the best price, right? Treasury wants to pay as late as possible. AP just wants a happy supplier, right? So how do you get all those aligned? And it's really just building an incentive program that aligns all the departments together so that the working capital strategy is deployed successfully.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot there because I find that actually really intriguing. Do you have any examples of any incentive programs that you know of that you've seen?
Yeah. So it's something with a working capital strategy, you're going to get a higher yield percentage when suppliers offer discounts. So just putting that into a pool and dividing it up amongst the different business units that are involved is pretty empowering, right? AP is when they can get a percentage as an annual bonus of what they're able to capture in discounts, they're going to help approve invoices faster, right? Procurement, if they're going to benefit from negotiating a term incentive on their annual bonus plan, they're going to help negotiate the best terms possible, right? So if everybody's aligned in that way, and with the working capital, it unlocks capital that can be used for certain things like this, right? A company could deploy 10% of the benefit to an annual bonus plan that can be divided up between the different departments that are involved.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. And I would just add to sort of along the lines of what you're talking about, Robert, that when we think about the KPIs and the reporting, the dashboards, that it's important to have a really solid communication strategy. So when you're going through all these efforts of having all the success, being able to report back the right information to the right group so they understand the impacts, right? As you mentioned, different people have different goals and roles in this process. So when you're talking to executives, for example, how you report results to them versus how you might report results to a particular end user group is going to look very different, and what's going to be meaningful. And then also not just throwing data at them and hoping that they're able to interpret it. It's about kind of telling a story with the data and sharing that information in a meaningful way to demonstrate the success of the strategy long term. So, Brent, I want to think about the change management impacts of this and what the possible impacts to a failing strategy would look like. And you started to talk before about some red flags to look for. So kind of a two-part question here. What are, if you were to list the top 3 red flags to look for that your strategy is starting to go downhill? And then also, what are some strategies to kind of get back on board to make sure that you're getting the right level of cooperation after you start to see that sort of trail off?
Yeah, let me start with probably the most dramatic red flag is bankruptcy. Ultimately, if you think about it long enough in the cash conversion cycle, which is loosely defined as the number of days it takes you to take inventory and turn it into cash. Ultimately, bankruptcy is the ultimate red flag. And I would invite any historians out there, go back and look at any major bankruptcy that made the national news. They're not too hard to find, and they happen from time to time. And what you'll find in almost every case is that company was profitable the day they declared bankruptcy. I'll say that again. That company was profitable, at least on a gross margin basis, until the day they went out of business. And so oftentimes I see organizations obsessing over the income statement because ultimately that's how most people are paid. But it is possible to be highly profitable and go bankrupt at the same time through a mismanagement of a working capital program. Specifically, and my expertise is in payables and receivables. So here's some canaries in the coal mine beyond that dramatic event of bankruptcy that you can see almost real time, and you know something's going wrong. And probably the most common is for companies that like to run supplier early payment programs. They precipitously stop doing so. And what happens is, for whatever reason, Treasury decides that the cost of accelerating a supplier payment from the net term, let's say the supplier's net term is 60, and you have some term in place to pay them on day 10 with a discount, ultimately that capital becomes too expensive, if you will, to do that. And so they precipitously stop. That's how I've seen most of the early warning indicators that there is a problem. On the converse end of that, if your suppliers in a given spend category precipitously stop taking early paid discounts, what you oftentimes find is that industry's aggregate days payable outstanding is moving out, and now you're paying too early compared to the market. And so the supplier is already getting the benefit of early payment just through the net term. So they stop taking early payment programs. And then, finally, this is a little bit more of a finance theme, right? It always starts with taking on debt. So tapping revolvers, because if you basically systematically, if you hold inventory constant, if you are getting paid later by your customers, and you're paying your suppliers earlier than that, you're going to have to finance the difference. This is always how it starts. And so you have to take on debt, at least in this narrow case, to finance the difference. And so that would probably be the third early warning indicator from a KPI perspective. And this was largely on the payable side. Lee, I'd be interested to hear from you on the receivables end of the business. What red flags do you see?
Yeah, I mean, you guys are setting me a challenge because you both speak so eloquently on your side of things that you're baking the cake and Robert's putting the cherry on it, and it's hard for me to bring value to the conversation. But I think when we look at DSO as a key metric of the working capital, then the challenges to the DSO are the things that are impacting on a customer's ability or willingness to pay on time. So traditionally, that's going to fall into sort of one of four components. There's the credit risk itself. So are they good for the money in the first instance? Secondarily, there's your invoice process. I touched on it before, but are you able to invoice in a timely and an accurate manner? Because that's going to impact on their ability to pay. Then there's the payment terms themselves. So we see here a scenario where suppliers want to get paid sooner, but customers want to pay later, and they are conditions that are moving in a mutually exclusive direction. And then the fourth one would be just the management process itself. So what do you do to keep your customer informed on the outstanding balances? Is there a reminder process and dunnings? Do you target the people that are likely to be delinquent? Is it proactive rather than reactive, et cetera, et cetera? So I think those are the four kind of well understood components of the accounts receivable space. I think everybody is working on incrementally improving those with process and technology and training, maybe augmenting the result with solutions and suppliers. The two things I think that are really big beyond that is, the first one is momentum. So to introduce good DSO practice in order to maintain your DSO, you're really talking about breaking habits, old habits, the way things are just done around here. and you need to kind of address them, challenge them, break them, and rebuild them. The key then is keeping that habit to stick, that you don't revert back to the way things used to be done. So that momentum is a key barrier to overcome. And then I think finally, and this is something I find within our client base, the challenge is less about momentum, it's less about maintaining DSO, it's actually about improving. We've got to go again. We've got to get better at this. In some respect, to become a victim of your own success. So if you are proven at reducing DSO, of bringing that benefit, a CFO is going to challenge you to bring more, do better. Let's take another cut under that. So I think all of those things is really what I'm seeing in the conversations I'm having with people. It's how do we get better? How do we go again? We've exhausted every avenue. Where do we find this win? I guess that's why people end up talking to us.
Yeah, these are all really good points. And if I can, for a moment, just call out to the audience, one key takeaway from the conversation today is don't rest on your laurels. Don't assume that the strategy you used, 6 months, a year ago is going to work. We talked about benchmarking, we talk about evolving, you're not going to be able to just apply that same approach every single time, once a year and expect the same results. So you have to really think about how the organization is changing and growing, the industry impacts. There are a lot of different things you have to think about to make sure that you're sharpening your axe, if you will, year over year, as it relates to your working capital strategy. All right. I think we've got through the majority of the questions that I had for the panelists today. So I just wanted to give you each just the floor for a couple minutes, perhaps, if you have anything else to add. If there is anything to add, this has been a very thorough conversation today. I, for one, have learned a few things myself, so I've appreciated your time today. So we'll just go around the room and we'll start with Robert and go from there.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, I think, working capital is an important thing to look at. Do you have the technology in place? Are you providing suppliers options? What's important? Is it DPO? Is it yield percentage? What's the right balance there? So I think just like you said, Jennifer, constantly evaluating, I think would be my closing comment is just, constantly be evolving and changing and improving.
Lee?
Yeah, I mean, working capital is business critical. It's a vital component of the health of any business. So it's one of those things that needs to be front of mind. And I think the analogy I think of best is like walking up and down an escalator. So you have to continually move in order just to stay still. You cannot rest, you cannot stop, you will lose momentum. So you've got to be constantly at it, even to maintain where you are.
Excellent. Brent?
Yeah, I guess I'll give good news and bad news. I suppose I'll start with the bad news. Why not? An effective working capital strategy is metaphorically like painting the Golden Gate Bridge, which is to say, if you start on one end and then you paint all the way to the other, by the time you get done, it's time to go back and start at the other end. So it is ever evolving because people change, right? Key leaders will come and go with different emphasis on, whatever they're trying to achieve. So internally, the organization is always changing with different priorities, and the markets are changing. So that affects your cash conversion cycle through when you pay your suppliers and when indeed you get paid by your customers. So keeping attuned with who's who in the zoo internally, and I'm going to give you a strategy for that, and then paying careful attention to the market that you're in by constantly sampling your customers and understanding their challenges, you're likely to be able to head off any working capital struggles that you may have coming down the road. And I'll kind of leave you with this, and it's kind of a story of what happens in almost every corporate every year, probably multiple times a year. but ultimately your CEO and your CFO primarily will meet with the board of directors, and they say to themselves, hey, what shall we do this year? And I can promise you they're probably not talking about, hey, let's improve working capital, because I have never in 20 years of doing this ever found an individual whose title was head of working capital strategy. It is a collective effort amongst us all. What they're talking about is, hey, should we create a new product? Hey, should we move into a new market? Hey, should we pay down debt? Hey, do we want to increase the dividend? They're talking about these business outcomes. And it is important to know what those business outcomes that are wanted by the board and the top leadership of a company, and then translating those into strategies. And working capital management is a strategy that can help manifest the various things that the company wants to do. They provide cash, and cash can be invested to go do those tangible things outside the firm. And so keeping that alignment between the ultimate business outcomes that a company wants to create and how, when we pay our suppliers and when we indeed get paid by our customers and how we manage our inventory can have a vast pervasive effect on the organization's ability to do it fast and quickly. If you go and look at the benefit of putting cash on the balance sheet and start calculating how much you would have to increase revenue to produce the same result, or how far you would have to decrease costs in order to produce the same benefit, you start to realize that this is a very important topic, and it can provide value very quickly, and it can also erode value very quickly. So diligence, keeping track of the people internally and keeping track of your customers is tantamount to building something of endurance that can last, for a very long time.
Thank you. Well, I don't think there's much to add to all of that. So thank you to the panelists today for joining us. I know you have very busy schedules, so appreciate you taking the time to talk to our audience today about this very important topic. And I will say that although I think what we've laid out today demonstrates the complexity of a working capital strategy and the thought process that needs to go into it, as well as the resources, the tools, all of that. But hopefully you're walking away with the understanding of how critical it is to address this as a strategy, as an organization as well, that it is quite possible to see some pretty substantial results when you do put the time and effort into this type of approach. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley to see if we have any questions from the audience. I know we only have like about 2 minutes left, and to see if there's anything to add from her perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It looks like we do have a couple of questions that came through, so we might have time for 1 or 2 of them. So the first one would be, our organization is fairly siloed. What challenges should we expect from this when it comes to a cohesive working capital strategy?
So I think, I don't know, maybe I'll push that one to Brent, where all we've been talking about is having that organizational alignment, but when you're naturally decentralized and you're already kind of facing that uphill battle of, having teams that aren't working together, how do you get them to work together on something so important?
In almost every case, it's the CFO. Sometimes you can get a strong treasurer, and rarely, but sometimes the CEO. But if the analogy is all roads lead to Rome, in the working capital space, generally speaking, all roads lead to the CFO. And it takes that kind of commitment from a person in that position to lasso the organization and have it march, in the direction that you want it to. It's been my experience. I can only think of a few working capital programs that I thought, were successful that didn't have the direct sponsorship of the CFO. It's just so. So if you,
that's really
you don't see that face, at the table, can't say, I'm not going to say you can't be successful, but it's going to be tough rowing.
And then I do want to circle back to we don't have to cover it in more detail, but again, I hadn't really considered what Robert mentioned around incentive programs. So, what else is going to incentivize people other than money, right? So putting that sort of program in place to drive more on the end user side of things. You talked about executive alignment, but then at the other end, how do we get everybody kind of marching to the beat of the drum? I think that's an excellent approach. All right, Ashley, any others?
Yeah, we might have time for a quick response on the other question that we have today, which is our goals shifted from the time we started our working capital strategy to today. What do we do if decisions made at the start of the program no longer make sense months later?
I'll step in here. Here, 100% chance this is going to happen to you. This always happens. You start out with a goal, and I'll just stick with the payables end of the business here. Hey, we want to pay our suppliers more competitively in the market, right? Which in this case would be we want to pay them on a longer term than we are today because we're trying to build cash. 18 months later, for whatever reason, the business is doing well. Now you're flush with cash, and now that strategy no longer makes sense. What you will find is the business will fluctuate through the business cycle and the vertical secular trends in your industry, that the cash will become in vogue and then out of vogue. And when you are flush with cash, you can use a working capital program as a way to generate high yield risk-free returns on your short-term cash, which is to say you can allow suppliers earlier payment in return for a discount. And if you think about it long enough, right, that's just you investing your cash to pay that supplier early. It's a form of financing. So start financing your suppliers and taking the yield off of your cash to generate a return. The same thing can be said with virtual cards. They approximately do the same thing. This question will always come up in your particular situation because business conditions change. The needs of the business and cash will fluctuate from time to time. And so there are different strategies to take advantage of that as the business conditions meet.
All right, thanks, Brent.
I just add this is this front of mind thing. It's not a one and done. A working capital strategy is not a one and done. It's permanently being assessed, refined, changed, pivoting, but it should always be front of mind if it's to be effective.
Great. Thank you, Lee, Brent, Robert, and Jennifer for your great discussion today. We also want to thank everybody that joined us today. And real quick, before everybody hops up, we would like to ask you to join us next week on October 5th. We'll be having a live discussion with Art of Procurement and the Senior Manager of Procurement from Alliant Credit Union, Dave Quillen, on how to create your savings roadmap for 2022. I'll go ahead and put the link for that in the chat right now, and then we'll also send it out to you again once we do our follow-up with the presentation from today. So again, thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.